So I'm going to just have Candace say a few words. Welcome, everybody. And we'll get started with our January PRAS meeting here on Zoom. Candace?
Hello, everyone. So just some practical things. So if you've got questions, I'm going to be monitoring the chat for Jared, our speaker. So just pop your question into the chat, and they'll come to a couple of points in his presentation where we'll do discussion questions. And if there's other information you want to share with us, whether what you've been seeing at your feeders or some great observations out in the field, just pop those into the chat as well. And again, you find that chat option if you hover towards the bottom of your screen. There should be a toolbar that pops up, and then just click on that. During the speaker's presentation, we're going to mute everybody, and if those of you might want to mute your video too. If you have any glitchiness with your Zoom, if it's freezing or something, sometimes it's a bandwidth issue, and if you mute your video, then it kind of clears that up. So that's a hint as well. All right. Very good.
All right, good. So again, welcome everybody. Francis tells me in our finances, right now we have $8,406.89. It's about where we like to be this time of year. So most of that's going to be spoken for the year. We haven't really changed anything that we've been doing with our costs. Same. Renewal postcards are a new thing. Those are just mailed today to about 250 people that might need a renewal notice. It goes back from the last 3 years for some people. Maybe we haven't heard from you yet in the last few years, or we just forget. So it's kind of a gentle reminder that we're still thinking of you. And there's that option of joining PRAS again as local membership for $15, or the National Audubon Society for $20, which gets you the magazine. And we always appreciate your support. Thank you. Dennis Schmadeke is sending out grant applications now. We've also decided to send out those to go to all our 6 counties, to their county conservation boards, directors, for ideas for projects that we can help with. We've designated $4,000 or more for those kind of grants. And we're also sending those out to our new bird-friendly cities, Waterloo, Cedar Falls, and Denver, to the contact people for those, or they may have a project that they want to do for bird-friendly cities that we can help with. And we always appreciate your donations and again, your memberships. So thank you. Today I'm remembering Bud Eason, who passed away on December 26th. Some of you may recall Bud and Jean Eason were board members for Audubon for quite a while. And so we're sad to hear about that. There's an obituary in the Guadalupe Courier today. I'm sure Jean would like to hear your support. Bud was 96 years old. A lot of us have been getting out to see the saw-whet owl at George Wythe State Park. It's back in the cedars where they usually are, and there's like a beaten path. There's a lot of people going back with cameras and things. It's a really great bird to be able to see. We want to remember our ethics when we go back to see this owl. It's very tame. We don't want to shake the tree to try to get it to open its eyes. And we want to avoid getting flash cameras or cell phones using a flash at a close distance, if at all. We see cameras that are pretty close, 2 to 3 feet away with continual flash, can either damage the bird's eyes, or if it flushes. There's great horned owls that are just about 100 yards to the east, 3 of them that hang out there, and that would make a snack for a great horned owl. A few years ago, we had somebody bring in a band from a saw-whet owl that they found in a barred owl pellet. It was really a rare thing to be able to find. So owls will eat each other too. So if you're out there and you you want to see the owl, that'd be great. Just to remember that be careful. If you see signs of the bird being changing its behavior, then it's a time to back off, really. And technically, it's probably illegal to disturb that owl on its roost area. So again, if you have something you've been seeing, we've been seeing some interesting things lately. There's quite a few trumpeter swans out at Brinker Lake by George Wythe. Tommy Stone has this spotted towhee coming to his feeders in his backyard over by Evansdale. I think I counted like 33 cardinals in his backyard, and red-breasted nuthatches. And you know, it won't be long, a couple of months, blackbirds and robins will be showing up again in our waterfowl. There's golden eyes on the river over by Cedar Falls, by downtown. I'm seeing some common mergansers around a little bit. So golden eagle's been spotted nearby, northern shrikes. And if you have something you want to share with us, please let us know. Especially if you find a common redpoll, that'd be cool. And or a snowy owl. There's been some of those spotted over the state recently. We will be doing our Climate Watch bluebird surveys from January 15th to February 15th. So those of you that have routes and stuff, I think I've sent an email out to you. Make some plans to do that and get your information. Again, thank you for your support. And if you have questions with what we're doing, feel free to send them to our chat here, or as we get our program going, or something to share. We'd love to hear from you. So good to see you all tonight. So we're going to get our program started. I'm excited to hear this. I heard Jared on the public radio a few years ago, right? Maybe it wasn't that long ago, doing a program, and we got to talking on our board. This is a guy we'd love to have in person at some time, but today we're lucky to be able to get him from Dubuque on Zoom. And Jared is the curator of the conservation programs at National Mississippi River Museum and Aquarium in Dubuque. It's a great place to go. They have very safe protocols in place right now. They had quite a few people go through the museum over the weekend. It's open for business. And I'm sure Jared will probably say some things about that as we get going along. He's a fellow Iowan from Piasta and a graduate from Iowa State and Clark University. And he likes to do ragbri on occasion. He has a little boy. It's 15 months, I think he said. Yep, 15 months, sleeping in the back room, we hope. And so his program tonight is on mussels and some on monarch butterflies. And so I don't want to tell any more about what he's going to do because he has a lot to share. And we'll turn it right over to Jared. Jared, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me. Again, my name is Jared McGovern. I'm the curator of conservation programming at the National Mississippi River Museum and Aquarium. How about a mic check? Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. All right, perfect. I can turn my teacher's voice on and start speaking from my diaphragm if you need to. All right, beautiful. So mussels and monarchs. They don't seem like animals that are going to be tied together very easily, but they are. They're very, very important. And one of the reasons that we chose mussels and monarchs at the National Mississippi River Museum and Aquarium as some of our ambassador conservation programs that we're building out is because of the messaging that grows from those animals as the champions for water quality and the champions for soil health and private lands conservation. At the National Mississippi River Museum and Aquarium, we are a member of the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. We are accredited by the American Museum Alliance. We are also a Smithsonian affiliate. And so we're part of a lot of national and international associations and networks focusing on conservation of wildlife and wild places, as well as political advocacy and community-based advocacy. So we're digging into a couple of those different areas. So like Tom had said, I am an Iowa boy. I grew up in Piasta. I'm a fifth generation Iowan from Western Dubuque County. I went to high school in Iowa. Both of my degrees are from colleges in Iowa. But I did go and travel around the country for a while, gaining experience in environmental education. Environmental education is where my experience is rooted, and just recently I've evolved a little bit more into more the in situ conservation in the field, and I'll get a little bit into that in a minute. I've done marine bird surveying, so Tom's throwing out bird names, and I was getting all kinds of jazzed. I wanted to go see the Southwest. I used to live in Bellingham, Washington, Pennsylvania, Texas, worked in South Dakota, as well as in Wisconsin. So Iowa is the greatest state in the country. Iowa stands for Incredible, Outstanding, Winners Abound. So hello, my fellow Iowans. All right, so I'm going to share a screen here real quick, and I will start the presentation. So you should be seeing my screen right now, and it should be a PowerPoint. There we go. So again, the National Mississippi River Museum and Aquarium is a really special place. Our mission is to inspire stewardship through educational experiences, specifically around cultural heritage and natural resources. We also have a branch of our mission that's now expanded into STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, where in my program, we're building out a lot of team-based programming, and you'll see a lot of that in the muscle work that we're doing throughout this presentation. You'll see in that picture there, that's me, and that's my wife, and that's my little boy, Freddie. That's Estes Park and Rocky Mountain National Park. That's one of the wild places I grew up. It's where I fell in love with environmental education, working with the park rangers out there every summer when my family went on vacation. So we were able to take Fred for the first time out there when he was not inside of his mother. And we'll be going back again this year. So just a really fun picture of Rocky Mountain National Park there. Now, what we're transitioning into here, this is the identity of the conservation programming department at the National Mississippi River Museum and Aquarium. And I'll remind you again that I started my career in education, and I will always be an educator, an environmental educator, because I truly believe in my heart of hearts that although people are the problem, every single environmental problem that we face can be traced back to human action currently. But we're also the solution. We've proven it time and time again that when we collectively choose to value something, we will make it better. And so what the River Museum and Aquarium is building currently is an identity that we are calling Take Care. And so at the National Mississippi River Museum and Aquarium, currently through mussel conservation and monarch restoration work, we are asking our community, our region on the upper Mississippi River and beyond, to take conservation action through advocacy, research, and engagement. Advocacy can be political. The River Museum, even though we are a nonprofit, we are able to do some forms of political advocacy as long as it is mission driven, and we're very careful with our funding. But community advocacy is the big thing. So advocating for positive change within our community, putting our money where our mouth is, and trying to enact and lead in real on the ground change. Research is a little bit different. So at the River Museum, we do some research. It's mostly applied research. A lot of the stuff that we're going to be doing isn't going to be published in peer-reviewed journals, but we are working to facilitate research opportunities with undergraduate students at some of our local universities, as well as working with agencies such as the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, City of Dubuque County Conservation Board, USGS, Bureau of Reclamation, in order to house some of their research on our campus so that we can give them exposure, since we're going to be welcoming almost 200,000 people to our campus over a normal year, not 2020, but in a normal year, we do see almost 200,000 visitors annually. And then engagement. Now, when you look at scaffolding in environmental education, it really starts with the cognitive, and then it builds into the affective, and then ultimately what you'd love to do is change behaviors of people. Sustainable behavior change. That's like the golden egg. That is the ultimate goal that you're trying to get to within environmental education. You have to know to care, and you got to care to act. That's one of my slogans that I share with a lot of the interns that I work with at the River Museum. So one of the leading lines of research currently states that the more people are provided an opportunity in order to act on behalf of wildlife and wild places, the more likely they are to internalize that change, internalize that behavior. So it's the whole practice makes perfect mantra. So the more opportunities people get to engage in authentic on-the-ground conservation where their hands are dirty, their work is helping to save species from extinction, the more likely they are to support that work in the future, either financially or continue to volunteer or to carry the work into their other communities that they're members of. And I'm not just talking cities, I'm talking the friend groups, I'm talking clubs like the Audubon Society, I'm talking the corporations in which they work. Building out with the museum as this convening force that is trying to inspire change throughout the community. So that's the big picture of what we're trying to do. Now, before we enter a quick discussion, when folks have any questions here, as we build this out, it's important for us to remember what we are as a conservation organization. Zoos and aquariums, collectively across this country, there's about 200 AZA, Association of Zoos and Aquariums, accredited facilities across the country. We see over 200 million people come through our front doors on a normal year annually. Collectively, the AZA is the largest conservation organization in the world. Now, AZA focuses on wildlife conservation. So what we are doing is rooting our messaging, rooting our advocacy, rooting our research in really two groups of animals. One being unionids, freshwater mussels. So we have an aquatic representative, aquatic ambassador. Another being monarch butterflies and other pollinators as a terrestrial ambassador. And the beauty of both of these is that people can work directly with them. And there are some really easy actions that every single person can take that will collectively lead to big needle moving change. So with that said, that was a lot. Does anybody have any questions or concerns at this point? Otherwise, I'm going to blow your minds real quick. No questions, Con? Okay, here we go.
No questions.
So this video is meant to make you fall in love with freshwater mussels. We filmed this at the National Mississippi River Museum and Aquarium with Iowa Public Television as part of their Iowa Land and Sky series that they did across the state. This is a quick one. Enjoy. You may want to crank up your volume. These YouTube videos have been fairly quiet since I've been using them on Zoom. So here we go. So did that blow anybody's mind? Every time I see it, I can't believe how efficient these animals are at filtering the water. So freshwater mussels are extremely important. We're going to get into that here in a little bit, but I want to lay the foundation here of why mussels actually matter. Freshwater mussels are a filtering organism. They do move, but they're fairly sensile, and they have one of the most amazing life cycles of any living organisms in the state of Iowa, in my opinion. I love freshwater mussels. I grew up on the Mississippi River. I grew up collecting their shells, following their trails out on the river. But it wasn't until college that I really started to fall in love with these animals because what they mean to Iowa waterways and waterways around the country. So freshwater mussels, the majority of the freshwater mussels that live in North America are in the genus family Unionidae. Most of those mussels use fish as a host in their life cycle. So they are going to be luring in fish. They're going to be attaching their larval form, their glucidia, to a fish, and that fish is then going to distribute those mussels as they swim around within their ecosystem. After a couple weeks, the mussels will fall off into the sediment and begin to filter the water before repeating the cycle all over again. Some freshwater mussels are host specific. They're only going to use one type of fish or a small group of fish. Others are generalists, and they're really going to use just about any fish that they come in contact with. They're going to have lures that look like minnows. They're going to have lures that look like crawfish, that look like larval insects, that look like worms. They're going to have lures that literally are a line and a lure. It is a bundle of glucidia attached to the mussel by a mucous membrane. It is a fishing line and a lure. These animals are insanely fascinating, and they are the most imperiled group of organisms in North America, if not the world. Roughly 75% of all known freshwater mussels are in need of some form of protection, and that does include 75% of about the 300, so it's around 297 species that have been identified in North America alone. North America has the greatest diversity of freshwater mussels of anywhere in the world. And in Iowa, we could find about 42. However, since about 1890, about 10 mussels have gone extinct that once found their home in the state of Iowa, and that's for many different reasons. We'll get into those in a minute, but first, why else are they important? Well, so they filter the water. They're extremely important in the nutrient cycling of the Mississippi River and freshwater systems. They're going to take nutrition out of the water column and deposit it through their feces and their burrowing action in the sediment, which is then going to oxygenate that sediment, and it provides habitat for other microorganisms as well. Their shells are a hard structure on an otherwise soft, barren ecosystem in many cases, especially on the Mississippi River. And so that'll provide physical structure for other invertebrates to hide. And it also traps dead detritus or vegetation that those invertebrates will feed on, which then attract other organisms such as fish that attract bigger fish, and so on and so forth. And they also, when they were in the mind-blowing numbers that they once were, they physically held the bottom of the river in place. So these animals are vitally important to the health of Iowa riverways, Iowa lakes, the Mississippi River, and especially in the rivers of the Southeast, where they are the most diverse. Now, what led to their decline? We're going to see that a little bit in this next video, but the big piece that started this decline was the button industry. The pearl button industry in the United States of America matured. It may not have been founded, but it matured in Muscatine, Iowa. Muscatine is still known as the pearl button capital of the world. John Frederick Beppel, a German immigrant, came to Muscatine in about 1890. By 1891, he had his shop up and running. And by 1910, 1911, we were already running out of raw material along the Mississippi River here in Iowa to feed the button manufacturing plants that had exploded in Muscatine and other river communities. We had to start importing blanks to the button factories in Muscatine as early as 1910, 1911. Now, John Frederick Beppel, unfortunately, and this is a very tragic death, he stepped on a mussel shell, as the story goes, while he was surveying mussels up in Indiana, cut open his foot, and he died of blood poisoning about a year later in 1912. So the man who brought the button industry to the shores of the Mississippi River was ultimately killed by a mussel. So whatever you want to say, he was also the first person who was employed through what became the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that actually started studying their life cycle. So John Beppel and Iowa, when it comes to the history of freshwater mussels as far as the extraction of the animal for a commodity, but also the conservation and protection of these species, are intimately intertwined. Iowa and the Burlington Fairport Biological Field Station, that's where freshwater mussel conservation work was born. So Iowa, right? Incredible, outstanding winners abound. It's also where Aldo Leopold was born. So who knows? Maybe there's just something in the water down there. On that note, does anyone have any discussion or any questions or comments about freshwater mussels, the Mississippi River Museum at this point?
Jared, I have a question. This is Candace.
Yeah.
So how do the toxins, and you might talk about this later, how do the toxins in the water affect the mussels?
Yeah, so freshwater mussels are also known as an indicator species. When you have any drastic change, and usually it has to be a change in water quality that lasts a period of time, because mussels do have the ability to shut their shells and they'll clam up even though they're not clams, and protect themselves for a short period of time. But eventually they got to breathe and they got to feed. So yes, manure spills or there has been a lot of work currently on viral pathogens that are starting to impact freshwater mussel populations across the country. When you have high nitrogen concentration in the water, cyanobacteria toxins, so when you have those big blue-green algae blooms, those are also toxic to freshwater mussels. So when freshwater mussels need healthy aquatic systems in order to thrive, they are sensitive to changes in their environment. Temperature is another big one. Flow regime, flow patterns, right? All of these different pieces have drastic impacts on the life cycle and the health of freshwater mussels. In fact, there was something that I was on a call today with a couple pathologists from University of Wisconsin-Madison, and they're working on a theory currently that they call, let me see if I can remember this, it's healthy, weak, sick, dead. They call it HSWD. And their theory is that healthy mussels, by some external force, say a climate change or a drought or some kind of a spill, that external change weakens those animals. And if it doesn't kill them immediately because it isn't toxic, then those animals will become potentially infected by some kind of viral pathogen. Then they become sick. Now, once you have a sick animal, the theory is that it may not be the viral pathogen that causes these mass die-offs, but instead you now transition into other parasites, bacterial infections, funguses that ultimately kill the animal. But it's those external forces that begin that downward trajectory. So there's also the discussion between conservationists as to where should we be intervening, especially if it's a viral pathogen that's been introduced. Should we be working with vaccines? Should we be working with breaking the chain once the animal becomes weak before it becomes sick? There's a lot of interesting discussion. Or should we be focusing on the piece that's causing the external force, such as climate change, that may be causing these animals to become weak in the first place? Freshwater mussel conservation is big. Like, there are a lot of really great people working on this across the country right now. I think I answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right, so I just did a lot of talking. I have another video here that I want to share with everybody. This video showcases some of the work that the National Mississippi River Museum and Aquarium has been doing with the Genoa National Fish Hatchery and local teens and youth over the last 5 years to engage people directly in freshwater mussel conservation on the upper Mississippi River. Oop, that is not what I meant to do. There we go.
The first part of the 20th century, latter part of the 19th century, because they were massively harvested from the industry. Muscatines, those that they would, just go out there with these massive rams and take every single mussel they could. Just whether it's using like raw
All right. So we've been doing that program annually every October now for the last 5 years, working with high schools in Wisconsin, Illinois, and Iowa, bringing students down. And these students hold federally endangered animals in their hands. That is huge. They're holding an animal that is on the brink of extinction, and they are directly engaging in real propagation for restoration, a project led by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. All of those animals that those students were working with will be released, or those ones have been released, that was 2 years ago, have been released back into either the Mississippi River or some of the other tributaries of the Mississippi River above Dubuque. Some of them they're working on right now are the Chippewa River is getting a lot of attention currently when it comes to Higgins eye pearly mussels and also snuffbox mussels, which is another federally endangered species that the Genoa National Fish Hatchery works with. So, we don't do these projects alone. We can't do these projects alone. Every single thing that we do has some kind of a conservation engagement, a community engagement piece, or it is something that we're working closely on with a partner. Now, before I take on a couple extra questions here, I would be remiss if I didn't mention REAP CEP and the Iowa Outdoor Recreation and Natural Resources Trust Fund. I'm not sure if you follow that as a society out there by Waterloo area, but REAP, the Resource Enhancement and Protection Program, is part of the Iowa Outdoor Recreation and Natural Resources Trust Fund, that 3/8% sales tax that was voted and approved into the Iowa Constitution that has yet to be appropriated funding because sales taxes haven't been raised since that was voted into law. There was a little traction last year, but REAP also was slotted to expire last year. Luckily, the legislation voted to extend it for an additional 2 years. But if the Iowa Outdoor Recreation and Natural Resources Trust Fund isn't funded in the next 2 years, we're going to be right back where we were, fighting for the future of REAP and REAP CEP, which also includes HRDP, the Historic Resource Development Program. So it's an extremely valuable piece of legislation. REAP, I would argue it's maybe one of the most successful conservation pieces of legislation in Iowa's history. And it's funded almost entirely through casino revenues and taxes on casino revenues. So if you love conservation, like I know you all do, I'm hoping that REAP CEP becomes a priority of yours in the next couple of years, if not this legislative session, which kicked off, I think it was yesterday. So had to throw out a REAP CEP shout out there. So questions, concerns, like how much do you love mussels now? I love these things.
Jared, there's a question from Gary Everdeen who's asking about, please comment on the invasive zebra mussels and the distribution in Iowa's waterways.
Yeah, so zebra mussels, we believe, came into the Great Lakes via Lake St. Clair. I think that's where Lake Huron and Ontario connect, I believe. And that was in about 1988. So since then, zebra mussels have spread throughout the entire navigable stretch of the Mississippi River. And from my understanding, they came in from the Illinois River. So zebra mussels are an interesting animal. Their life cycle is quite a bit different than our native freshwater mussels. They do not require a host species. They are a host, and their larva, which is known as Velger larva, as opposed to Glaucidia, which is our native mussel larva, it's free swimming. It has cilia or cilia, and it can swim until it attaches to a solid surface. And from that point, it connects and it starts to filter, feed, grow, and develop its hard shell. So I've spoken to a couple of biologists over the years, and one of the reasons a lot of Iowa is considered prime mussel habitat, and one of the reasons you've seen like the Iowa River, the Cedar River, and the Wapsipinicon River as release sites for the Higgins eye pearly mussel recovery plan over the last decade plus, is because those are zebra mussel negative bodies of water. Because zebra mussels, if they are released in those areas, they flush downriver. They're not brought back upriver. On the upper Mississippi River, zebra mussels, mature adults, are constantly brought back upriver on the hulls of barges or recreational boats. And zebra mussels will only go one direction. Like if we halted all commercial recreational transportation on the Mississippi River, which I don't recommend we do. Iowa's economy really, really depends on that. Within 50 years, you could see zebra mussels flushed out of the upper Mississippi River, theoretically. So in Iowa's waters, I'm most worried about them myself when they're introduced into lake systems, into lemnic systems, because then the Velger larvae are not distributed by gravity, but by wind currents. And so they're just being circulated around, which is why the Great Lakes, there's no getting rid of them. Yet there's hope on smaller river systems. Now, zebra mussels and the impact they've had on freshwater mussels. They are still a problem. And when you read some of the recovery plans for the endangered freshwater mussels, they look at established self-sustaining populations that are in zebra mussel negative bodies of water, unless, and in some cases, the Mississippi River is called out as an exception because the mussel population is fairly robust still on the Mississippi River. And that's because these animals do attach to solid structures. Freshwater mussel on the bottom of the river. I've pulled up mussel shells myself on the Mississippi where you'll have a bundle of zebra mussels that are bigger than the animal that they're connected to. And if those animals aren't removed, they will smother that animal and kill it. So zebra mussels are still a major threat to native freshwater mussels. However, the majority of Iowa's riverways, they don't really have them because there isn't a whole lot of recreational or commercial transportation that's constantly running up them.
So Anne asks, please give specific ideas what we can do to help.
I'm glad you asked. So I don't know if you guys have heard of this program, Good Neighbor Iowa. So Good Neighbor Iowa is a program through the University of Northern Iowa's Center for Energy and Environmental Education. And it focuses on yard practices that are wildlife and water quality friendly. So freshwater mussels, as we had mentioned a little bit earlier, they're very sensitive to changes in water quality, and they are an indicator of when water quality is drastically declining. So collectively, if we decide that we're going to limit pesticide applications, especially systemic pesticide applications onto our yards, if we collectively decide that we're going to be prioritizing native plantings that are preventing runoff and flash flooding, then we are going to be helping to improve the habitat of freshwater mussels. Anything that we can do on the land that is going to slow the water, increase infiltration, and prevent massive amounts of surface runoff happening after every rainfall event is going to help freshwater mussels. Decrease erosion, decrease runoff, increase infiltration. All of these things are going to help freshwater mussels. So those are things that you can do just at your community level. Now, as far as the advocacy side of things go, you can advocate for funds. You can support organizations that are working directly on mussel conservation, such as the Iowa DNR and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Go visit the Genoa National Fish Hatchery if you haven't done that, up in Genoa, Wisconsin. It is a remarkable place doing wonderful work. Support the work of the people who are championing these efforts. That's what we try to do with the River Museum. And we don't do all this stuff ourselves, but we can be this mouthpiece. We can be this champion of the work that's being done in the watershed.
A couple more questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, by all means.
Okay, so Susan asks, what impact does dredging have on mussels? And she means the large dredging projects in order to maintain the 9-foot depth channel for the barge transportation. And then her second part of her question is whether or not you've visited the Driftless Land Visitor Center in Lansing and whether or not you helped develop their display on mussels.
I have not been there, and I did not help design their display on freshwater mussels. Our marketing director, Wendy Scardino, was involved in that process when she was with United Way. But no, I was not involved in that. Now, when it comes to dredging, it kills them. It kills the mussels if they're sucked up through a dredge and then dumped off channel. It'll bury them. And so dredging operations do have incidental kill of freshwater mussels, which is why when dredging operations are underway, there is a lot of effort taken to mitigate the damage as much as possible. And I'm speaking from experience this past summer. Hurricane Island, which is just across from Finley's Landing here in Dubuque, it's technically on the Wisconsin side, but that's a stretch of the Mississippi River that is very tricky. It turns really, really sharp, and it's constantly silting in. So they're constantly having to dredge that stretch of the Mississippi River, but they got to put the dredge sand somewhere. And so sometimes they use this dredge material to build out habitat rehabilitation enhancement programs that are meant to establish waterfowl and fish habitat on the upper Mississippi River and mitigate from lock and dam construction damage that has happened since the 1930s when they were built in this part of the Mississippi River. But some of it is just used to build islands. On the Hurricane Island, there was a big mussel bed on the opposite side where a lot of this dredge sand was being slotted to go. They were prepping this area to be a deposit site. So we went out there with the Fish and Wildlife Service, 2 different DNR agencies, county conservation boards, the River Museum, and we spent days and days and days collecting as many mussels as we possibly could from areas that were going to be impacted by this dredging operation, and we relocated them to areas that would not be impacted, specifically areas just upriver. So it's, yeah, dredging kills mussels. But when we know exactly where that dredge material is going to go and we know that we can do something about it, something is almost always done about it. So that was really a cool project to be a part of this past summer.
Very good. And one last question from Judy Stiers. The Waterloo Courier article said that rare black bandshell mussels that were pregnant were driven to Minnesota to a restocking program. Her question is, how do you know a mussel is pregnant?
Oh, that's a good question. So sometimes it has to do with seasonality. Some mussels are going to be what they call gravid. That's when they have fertilized eggs inside of a tiny little pouch that's in their gills, which is called a little marsupial. A gravid mussel will be displaying, so a lot of times they'll have their lure out, but other times you'll have to take it's a prying wrench, and you'll open them up just slightly, just enough not to hurt them. And if you see their gills are inflamed, it's because they're full of either glaucidia or full of eggs. And so that's when you know that that animal is pregnant. Also seasonality. Some species are going to be gravid in the spring. Others will be gravid in the winter, which is also interesting. And then in the fall. One of the animals that's gravid in the winter, which is really interesting, is the early spring, actually, is the salamander mussel. It's the only mussel here that does not use a fish as a host. It uses mud puppy, and mud puppy are most active in the winter and spring when water temperatures are below 60 degrees, which is kind of the opposite of every other mussel breeding cycle, because fish aren't the most active when the water temperatures are that cold.
Fascinating.
Cool.
That is
All right.
so interesting.
So am I supposed to end at 8? I just feel bad because I've got a lot more to do. All right, I'm going to skip this next one then. So there's another video that I was going to share with you, but I'm going to skip that video. But that video was showcasing something that we were able to do this summer. Unfortunately, we were not able to do our propagation work on the lower dock. Schools were canceled in March, and then this upcoming fall, schools were not going on field trips, and we're unfortunately expecting that to be the same come spring. We did not do our propagation work on the lower dock this summer because the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was worried that they would not have travel permissions to come and get their animals, and that they would not be able to allow public at the hatchery to deliver the animals because of the COVID pandemic, and they were right. So unfortunately, we didn't have those animals on site. But what we did do this year was in the Bee Branch Creek Greenway. There's a stretch of river in Dubuque, the most heavily populated part of Dubuque, that was buried for over 100 years underground in an 8-foot by 8-foot diameter culvert. That pipe was daylighted about 6-7 years ago. It was brought back to the surface, and when it was being designed as a flood mitigation strategy, kind of a community resiliency practice, it's a man-made floodplain, they created wildlife habitat structures within the stream bed because it's a spring-fed river, and that part of town used to be known as Frog Town because it was this marshy, slow-moving area that was extremely biodiverse and filled with amphibians. We started a habitat suitability and survivorship study with the University of Dubuque and with the Green Iowa AmeriCorps, as well as a Multicultural Family Center and a couple other community organizations this summer. We were able to do a mussel engagement outside in the Bee Branch Creek, and we found that the animals do fairly well there. So we're very hopeful, and we're going to continue this research project with community partners and with students and with the community that constantly walk this greenway now, because what's happening now this summer is they're completing the project, which is basically them removing a dam. They're removing a barrier that limits fish passage into the Bee Branch Creek from the Mississippi River. Once that barrier is removed and fish begin to migrate up into the greenway, those fish will bring mussels with them attached to their gills. And so we're going to look at a stream which is void of mussels besides the one that we put in there. And we're going to see what happens as fish repopulate this stretch of stream and as mussels repopulate this stretch of stream. So it's going to be a lot of fun. We just started that this past summer, and that's what the next video was going to show you. But I think I need to transition into monarchs here real quick so that I don't go super far over my allotted time. Okay, so freshwater mussels, that program is an established program that the museum is very involved in and very invested in. That program, we build out a lot of watershed programming, a lot of watershed messaging around erosion prevention, around prevention of toxins running into the river, invasive species messaging, as well as microplastics and plastic pollution as well. There's been a couple studies that local universities have done where microplastics are in fact being accumulated in the fatty tissues of freshwater mussels. They're eating these things as they filter the Mississippi River. So that's where mussels live. Just this year, we became a member of what's known as Monarch SAFE. SAFE stands for Saving Animals from Extinction. It's a program within the Association of Zoos and Aquariums that is meant to align and activate that 200 member strong network of zoos and aquariums that stretch across the country. And within the Monarch SAFE program, the priority areas are in creating a conservation corridor for migratory monarch butterflies. That also is going to help birds. It's going to help with water quality. It's going to help with investments in things like regenerative agriculture. It's going to help with climate change because we're going to be focusing on healthy soils. And when you have healthy soils and you're returning habitat to natives, you're sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it underground. So all of these different messages, all of these different engagement opportunities grow from monarch conservation. And monarch conservation can be done by anyone with a patch of dirt. Anyone with a patch of dirt. The eastern population of the monarch butterfly, as you can see in the map on the left that Monarch Watch had published, ends at the Rocky Mountains, technically, at about the Continental Divide, and it extends all the way to the Atlantic coast. They overwinter in one forest area down in Mexico, and the Corn Belt here in the Midwest is one of the prime breeding habitats for that third and fourth generation of monarch butterflies. This area can make and break a spring breeding season, or a summer breeding season, pardon me. This area also has the added distinction of being mostly privately owned. So if you look at this map on the right, you'll see that all of these different colors, you won't be able to read the key that's on the bottom, but basically these are all the different federal agencies that own and operate land, state parks, county parks, fish and wildlife refuges, even energy companies, and then also into the ocean, you can see what NOAA and the Bureau of Energy manage. Iowa is about 97% privately owned. The United States as a whole is about 83% privately owned. So with monarchs in particular, not just monarchs, but also mussels, because of the water quality implications, that the improvements in water quality that we can see when we manage for healthy soils and for invertebrate populations has really no limit. it's the sky is the limit, moon's the limit, the sun's the limit, what have you, Milky Way, the next galaxy is the limit, which is why private lands conservation is so important, especially in the Midwest. And so those are areas that we at the River Museum are growing into, our private lands conservation around advocating for policies that are going to support landowners, providing resources, incentives, educational opportunities to adopt conservation practices on their property. Backyard national park movements are one of those. In Iowa, the biggest impact is going to happen on our Department of Transportation land, energy land, and agricultural properties, just because that's the majority of the land is in those three categories. But in our urban habitats, we can also make huge strides by connecting wild places through cities. So I think of Dubuque, for instance. We have the Mines of Spain State Recreation Area on the south. And then as you go to the north side of town, you get into proving grounds, you get to the Mississippi River, you get into some of these little pocket areas of diversity in these goat prairies, but they're not connected. There's no connectivity. They're more or less separated by barren desert of non-native horticultured plants from Europe and China and well-manicured yards that are oversprayed for anything that isn't Kentucky bluegrass. If we change that mindset, if we can change how these yards and these properties are managed and what people perceive as a healthy yard, we can help create that connectivity again. We can create these bigger pockets of biodiversity right in cities. That can happen. And that is one of the things that the River Museum is building out currently. And we will be beginning with this in the spring with the construction of a greenhouse. So we are working with Growspan in Dyersville right now. We have the money to do this. We were able to partner with the County Conservation Board. We were able to partner with a couple private donors. We're going to be building a 326 square foot greenhouse where we will be head starting prairie wildflowers and wild grasses, so cool season wildflowers and warm season wild grasses. And all of those plugs will be gifted to community members around Dubuque who are going to commit to transitioning a portion of their turf in their yard or on their property into a pollinator habitat. Now, they're also going to be committing to reducing pesticides. When they do use pesticides, they're going to use non-systemic pesticides. Things are going to break down quickly in the soil and will not be washed off into aquatic ecosystems, ideally, I'm gonna knock on wood, because there's no foolproof pesticide. And we're going to be placing that on our campus. So not only are we going to be doing this work and providing this resource and this service to our community to try to improve that connectivity, we are also going to be exposing roughly 200,000 visitors annually to the messages of Monarch Safe, which are a conservation corridor, reducing pesticides, transitioning turf and otherwise sterile habitat to pollinator habitat, working with nurseries in order to build a native plant market. Because if you go to Lowe's, if you go to Walmart, the likelihood of finding natives that aren't covered in pesticides, that's pretty low. And then also working especially in some more of our temperate and tropical areas of the country, more tropical areas of the country, tropical milkweed. So an invasive milkweed is really, really messing with monarchs in Florida, Texas, on the Gulf Coast, and in California. So trying to eliminate that from the nurseries and from people's backyard plantings as well. So Monarch Safe is something we're growing into right now. And all of this can be done. All of this is going to be led and worked through volunteers, through team leadership programs. And with the team programs in particular, these are more of a kind of a phenomena, try to get their hands dirty, figure out what types of conservation there are. Hopefully there'll be new questions the teams will ask. And then those teams will then be directed to build out their own community conservation projects that we will fund and we will help to facilitate. So that's the Monarchs. I do have one message on the Western population, which again, the Western population and the Eastern population don't usually mix. There are areas where the populations will have some genetic drift, but the Western population is much worse off. The Western population has seen almost a 99% decrease over the last, I want to say, even 10 years, since 2010. No, 90, since 1990, the last 20 years. The Eastern population has seen about an 80% decrease. The Western population currently, according to the Thanksgiving count, which is done every November on the coast of California, they only found 2,000 animals this year. 2,000. There were 28,000 last year. 2,000 is well below the extinction threshold of the Western population. And you may have seen in the news recently that the monarch butterfly was deemed to deserve protections under the Endangered Species Act. However, it was not granted said protections. And what that means is that you can't separate out the Eastern and Western populations under the law within the Endangered Species Act. It's the same species. So even though the Western population is very close to extinction, and a lot of researchers and partners of mine out there, they do point to the extreme wildfire seasons that we've been experiencing that have really, really impacted the numbers over the last 2 years. But what the good news is, though, is that because the monarch is now considered to be justified for listing, it's going to be reviewed every year. It'll go through an annual review process every year for the next 4 years. So it should, by year 4, receive protections under the Endangered Species Act. Whether it'll be listed as threatened or endangered, that's yet to be seen. But some good has already come out of this as well, because there's a massive volunteer conservation project that is gaining a ton of momentum, where energy companies and transportation companies are pledging to plant natives and manage their land for monarch and pollinators. So anytime you see those power lines going straight through the timber in a state park, all of that is going to be managed, in Iowa at least, for pollinators. Iowa DOT, county DOTs, roadside ditches. That's not just Iowa that's doing that. There's other states within that migratory corridor that are also starting to prioritize this. So there's a lot of hope around monarchs. And in the Corn Belt and here in Iowa, we can do a lot to help this species. But if you help monarchs, you're helping so many other things as well. Monarchs and mussels are the ambassador species that are going to, at the museum, drive so many other positive changes through the messaging and the programming that we're currently building out. And on that note, as Dr. James Pease would always say, are there any questions, concerns, or mildly inappropriate comments?
Right.
And I will stop sharing so you can see my face again. And hopefully I got you excited to build a pollinator habitat, quit spraying pesticides, and support mussel conservation in the state of Iowa.
Thank you, Jared. It was really great. I was trying to send a couple of questions on monarchs to you in chat. I haven't figured that out yet. But 2 things. You talked about tropical milkweed with me earlier. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that was a concern that you had.
Not in Iowa.
Not in Iowa, but
not in Iowa, but monarchs are migratory. So any disturbance along their migratory path is going to drastically impact the animal's population. It's just like with bird migration. You know, monarch conservation is an international conservation project, just like neotropical migrants that are coming through the state of Iowa, or breeding in the state of Iowa, or breeding along the Mississippi River that overwinter in Mexico, Central America. What tropical milkweed does is it blooms year-round. And when tropical milkweed is blooming year-round, it interferes with the monarch butterfly's annual life cycle. And so they will, unfortunately, breed on that milkweed during a time of year when they're supposed to be overwintering. And their young aren't going to survive. And the whole process is just all janky. You threw something into a system that doesn't belong, and it's really messing with a very specialized relationship between milkweed and monarchs. And that's something that, when I mentioned the backyard national park movement, it's really built on planting natives in your yard. Most relationships between your primary consumers, which are mostly your insects, and your producers, which are your native plants, are very specialized. I mean, if you have a yard that is only European, Chinese, and exotic species, you're not going to have a lot of insects in your yard. If you don't have a lot of insects in your yard, you're not going to really have a whole lot of anything else. So if you can create and rebuild that connectivity between your producers and your primary consumers, native plants, native insects, you really can begin a cascade of benefiting other species, especially birds. Birds aren't eating seeds during breeding season. They're going after insects. A lot of caterpillars, a lot of protein needed during that period of time. And there's 3 major trees that you should prioritize in your yards. 3 major groups of trees that are going to be host to the largest diversity and abundance by mass of caterpillars. You're looking at your oaks. You're looking at anything in the Rosaceae family. So if you want to put wild plum or different cherries, and you're looking at salix, you're looking at willows. If you have willows, something in the Rosaceae family, and oak trees in your yard, you have a host. You will have species that are going to play host to a huge diversity of wildlife. I'm talking hundreds of different species. Just those 3 tree orders.
Second thing I had was I see monarchs in Costa Rica, and I believe in Australia. And if I remember right, are those a different species, related, or race, or what?
They're different species. Yep. So they're a different species unless they were introduced. I'll have to look into that. But the North American monarch is a distinct species.
So a couple of comments in the chat. One with regards specifically to the tropical milkweed. Anne shares that she knows someone who plants tropical milkweed to sell as cut flowers. So the idea of maybe kind of boycotting that to kind of, counteract that. She says it's beautiful, unfortunately, which is why people plant so many non-native things.
Oh yeah, they're easy. I blame Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson and his cronies back in the day, they're the ones that brought the European model of what a healthy garden looks like into North America. And Thomas Jefferson was one of the first people to start importing buku European species as well as Chinese species to the United States. And it was a status symbol. Green yards, and unfortunately, if you read some of these stories in these books, it would either tell you how many sheep you owned or how many slaves you owned, because that massive amount of land needed a ton of work, and those sheep would graze that grass down and allow you to have that European-esque garden. Now, when the middle class exploded in the 50s, everybody wanted that yard. Everybody wanted a yard that showed it as a status symbol. And that's when you started having all these synthetic pesticides that were being manufactured from chemical companies after World War II, and it just cascaded from there. And so today, it's easier to spray. There's less maintenance if you're going to go buy a European or a Chinese species. And for some reason, and I still can't put my finger on this, it seems that the European and the Chinese species are the ones that you find most at your local greenhouse, your local nursery. Native plants do best here. Simple solution is to prioritize native.
And just along that line, so you said willows, oaks, and what?
And the Rosaceae family. So you're looking at wild plums, different cherry species that are native. Black cherries, I mean, they're really big, so you may not want to, if you want a black cherry on your yard, it's going to be a really big tree eventually. But things like choke cherries, I love wild plums because you can make them into like a shrub line.
Uh-huh.
Will break.
And then we had,
You can make wine out of that. They're delicious.
yeah, wild
Plum
plums. are
wine.
great.
All right.
And then we had one more question about mussels, Jared.
Yes.
So Linda wants to know, what effect does salt use on roads in winter have on mussels?
So mussels do not do well when there's high conductivity in the water, and added salt concentration increases the conductivity in the water. So what we've seen in Dubuque, I think this was 2018. We had that extreme flood season where the ice harbor in Dubuque was closed in March and it stayed closed until June. Water on the Mississippi River was above extreme flood stage for about 85 days. That's the longest the flood gates have ever been shut. That was before the spring melt. So the chloride levels in the ice harbor skyrocketed. The conductivity went through the roof. The copepod population exploded, and the chlorophyll in the water like disappeared. So there was like no food. We had some pretty high mortality in our systems. So yes, when the salt concentration gets high for an extended period of time, it is going to stress the mussels and it will lead to mortality. The Mississippi River and a lot of our major rivers, our bigger rivers like the Cedar and the Iowa and the Des Moines, they dilute that salt runoff so much, and it's usually more of a shock after a runoff in the spring that I haven't seen salt cause massive die-offs of freshwater mussels. It may be one of those contributing stressing factors. But in smaller systems, we are currently doing a study continuing in the B branch, so I'll know more after this winter. The B branch creek, for some reason, it had maintained a fairly high salinity over the summer, and I don't know why it did that, probably because of where the city dumps a lot of its snow during the wintertime. But we are tracking water quality now through the winter to see what and when these big chloride flushes happen. And then we left our mussels in over the winter. We're going to return and look at winter mortality to see if that was potentially a contributing factor to mussel survival in the B branch.
Candace, do you have anything else? A couple comments coming through.
There's one other question about apple trees. What about apple trees in terms of good native apple tree to plant?
So the funny thing is when I think of apples, I don't really think there are any native apple trees. They're drafted. I'm not sure there are any North American trees, but apple trees are fine to plant. I mean, it's a fruit that you're going to have, and it's also going to be really important for early season pollinators. It flowers early in the spring, and so it's going to be providing nectar for all sorts of different species. Monarch butterflies, however, by the time your apple tree is done blooming for the season, monarchs aren't here yet. Usually, they're migrating north still during that time period. Even though monarchs they're going to be nectar generalists, they're going to feed off of just about any flowering plant. Yeah, apple trees are amazing for pollinators, especially for spring bees and bees that overwintered as adults, like bumblebees. I'm not sure they're a host to a lot of species of caterpillar, however, just because they are a non-native species.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Lots of good questions.
Non-native species are hosts, though. And that's something you'll see too. There's this, that there are invasive species that do play host to small numbers of species. So an invasive species can be good for like this small group of animals, but in the grand scheme of things, native is better because native has these specialized relationships with other organisms that have evolved over thousands and millions of years that just don't exist with species from Europe and China that have been imported to the US. And I say Europe and China just because the majority of the non-native plants that we see are European species and Chinese species because the climate is similar, in Iowa at least. And on the Northeast. Northeast is like that too. There's actually a book that you might really enjoy. I read this one. This was one of my 2020 books. And he was in Nat Geo. He was a professor at the University of Delaware. And I can't remember the title. I think it was something with Backyard National Park Movement. If you Google the Backyard National Park Movement, it should pop up. In fact, I'll do that for you right now, see if I can't find it.
Is it Bringing Nature Home?
Don't know. There were two different books that this Robert Sterling, I believe was his name. Nope, that's an older, that's from the 1800s. Never mind. Homegrown National Park. No, that's Richard Louv. That's not right. Nope, that's not him either. Sorry about that. Oh, yep, this is the guy. It's Richard Louv shared it. His name is Jerry Adler. And his book is called here. Oh, sorry, Jerry Adler's not. All right, I'm really bad at this. He's the author from the Smithsonian Magazine where the article is. Douglas Tallamy is the author.
Yeah.
If you've not read his work, I really latched on to what he was saying. It was pretty timely, especially with the plight of the monarch butterfly across the country.
I agree. Excellent books, and he's been a speaker in Iowa a number of times. He'll be back again next year.
Oh, will he? Nice.
Yeah, he was supposed to speak in Cedar Rapids this last spring, but got canceled. You know, but
He has two books, I believe, and the most recent one, I think the most powerful piece for me was when he was walking around Oregon, and everybody's like, Oregon is the greenest, has the most trees, and as he's walking around, it's all Norway maple. in Portland, Oregon, there's no native trees on the street.
Yeah, good point.
So it's like it's silent, right? You have all this green, but then there's no birds because there's no bugs.
Well, this has been wonderful. We hope we can get a group to come down and visit. In the meantime, if you're looking for a road trip, anybody on your own, go to the Mississippi River Museum. It's a great place to visit. And if you're a kayaker, be looking out for mussels on your trips on the rivers. And
yeah, there's a book that you can look at. It's a really easy one. The Fish and Wildlife Service has these for free. It's called Freshwater Mussels of the Upper Mississippi River. It's got about 30 species in it. It's not every species you're going to find in the state of Iowa, but it's a really good guide. Great pictures, descriptions, tells you if it's an endangered species, in what state, how it's protected, what its range is. It's a really good one to keep in your pocket, and you can get them for free from the Fish and Wildlife Service. As far as kayaking and bird watching too, I don't know if you make trips over to Dubuque during the spring migration, but if you do, I'd welcome you, and we'll head down to John Deere Marsh and see if we can't get 30 or 40 species in a single day.
sounds great. Thank you, everybody. Is there any other comments, Candace, or from anybody else?
I'm not seeing any more in the chat.
Between a mussel and a clam.
Yep.
Yeah, there you go.
I was
got
waiting
Jared,
for that
yep.
one.
Uh-huh.
I was waiting for that one.
Good one.
Yeah, so the way that I've always just differentiated between the two has a lot to do with their shell shape and then also their life cycle. Freshwater mussels, and this isn't just mussels in general, this is freshwater mussels. The majority of them are unionids and they require a host to complete their life cycle. Most clams do not. They'll have that free swimming larval form that does not have to connect to a species as a parasite for a period of time. And then also shell shape. Mussels are asymmetrical. If you look at the beak, freshwater mussel, and this is an extreme example because this is a black sand shell. So the beak's right there, and then you have an elongated ventral, and then dorsal side. This is where your siphons are going to be. This is usually on the longer side, and the foot will usually be coming out of the shorter side of the muscle. Clams are more symmetric in shape. And I'd also say that a lot of times clams are more brackish or saltwater. You know, we do have an Asian clam, and we have what's called a fingernail clam that you'll find in Iowa. The Asian clam's not native, and that's from brackish ecosystems, but it can survive in freshwater. And the fingernail clam, that lives in a lot of our cold water streams. You find a lot of those around here, and that is a native one.
Very good.
Yeah,
I think that
it's weird. It's the whole, you know, the taxonomic common name pieces. You know, you got mussels that live in saltwater, mussels that live in freshwater. They're very different.
I had just one last question. This is Candace, of course. Is there poaching of freshwater mussels still in our waters?
Mm,
Is that a problem?
not so. There used to be, they called him the clam cop. I've met this guy at conferences before. He's really funny, but his work was mostly when the pearl button, the cultured pearl industry in Japan and China were really driving harvesting of freshwater mussels on the upper Mississippi River and across North America, because the shells were being used as the core, the little cube that was placed inside of the oysters, and then they would build a pearl around that freshwater mussel core. But since that industry kind of collapsed, it isn't as big of a problem. I won't say it doesn't happen. It definitely does. And mussels, it's still legal to go out and collect them as bait for things like trot line. Commercial fishermen still use mussels. You just need to know what you're collecting, because if you accidentally collect a protected species, you can be in trouble. And we do, but as far as massive, large-scale poaching efforts, I don't hear a whole lot about that anymore, not from a lot of our partners. The biggest thing that you see now is mitigation from spills and big kills of mussels when tankers spill or sewage ponds overflow, or you're have a heavy rainfall and your sewage treatment plant decides to stop processing all the water that's leaking into the sewage pipes because they're 150 years old.
Okay.
Yeah, that's usually when you see those. But as far as poaching, no. I mean, it's illegal in Iowa. Wisconsin's very, very strict as far as their regulations on freshwater mussels.
Mhm. That's good to know. It's good to know that it's no longer a pronounced problem. So,
Yeah, and the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, that was kind of, Wild West with mussel harvesting. I heard stories about people that would fill bags and then sink the bags and then come back and get them later. There was a lot of poaching going on during the heyday of the cultured pearl industry overseas.
yeah. Okay. Well, I don't see any other comments in the chat.
okay.
Thank you. This was so fascinating.
Well,
I hope it was what you were looking for. I'm sitting here virtually. Usually I would have you all act out the life cycle if we were in person. Some
Yeah.
people fertilize the eggs and then we would have fish. It's a really fun activity. Unfortunately, your groups are only two. So it's kind of hard to do when there's two of you in a room, and it's impossible if there's only one of you.
Well, this has been fantastic. We'll look forward to meeting you in person here someday.
Yeah, come to the River Museum, have some fun with us, and keep spreading the hope, right? I
Yeah.
like seeing this number of people around the great state of Iowa doing cool things, because if you don't have hope, then nothing will be done. If you don't believe anything can be done, then it never will be. So hopeful's not a strategy, but it's a start.
We're doing a lot of more of a push with our Audubon about, like Doug Tallamy says, like backyard national park, about you build it, they'll come, for birds and butterflies and a lot of things, and it's so true. And so it's part of our mission thing. a number of our speakers have brought this up, and it's a good point to make. So.
It's something that anyone and everyone can do. And people ultimately want to do good. There's very, very few malicious people in the world that do bad just to do bad, right? And change is hard. You have to understand that too. Change is very, very difficult for almost every single person. We're creatures of habit. We get into routines, and that extends into the way that we do our yard. We also don't like confrontation usually. So if your neighbor's over here judging you, I mean, you should see my yard. Is way different than my neighbor's yard. And I know there's always this little bit of silent judgment happening when I don't have those brown ace bags on the side of the street in the fall, and it's mulching and building leaf piles all over the place. So I know what's happening, but it takes time, unfortunately. But we've done it before, and so we're going to be able to do it again. It just takes a collective shift in people's value systems, and it starts with organizations like this.
Yep. Well, you'll have to push for the city of Dubuque to apply for to be a bird-friendly community.
I think that's on the list. I'm working with, so we got the county involved in the Monarch conservation work. City wants to be involved. They've reached out, so I'm hoping to expand a little bit into their greenhouses since they already have a pretty solid setup. As far as bird-friendly city goes, I don't see that being much of a stretch. We got enough folks that would champion something like that in Dubuque that I really could see us having some big success there.
Yeah, it's a lot of similar mission, for stormwater,
Our mayor loves
plants,
that kind of stuff. City of Dubuque, our mayor runs on arts and culture and sustainability. That's his platform, and he's the longest serving mayor in Dubuque's history.
Good. Well, thank you. I don't have anything else. It's good to see so many people on. And unless we don't have any other questions, I think we can call the meeting, and you can go visit with your wife for your son.
Well, he's been passed out for like an hour and a half. So.
Okay, good. You hope, yeah, okay.
If he's still up, then we got a problem. I mean,
yeah, right. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. And we'll see you next month. We have Rob Schultz, who's the vice president of the Mississippi River Flyway for Audubon. And he's one of the top dudes for Minnesota Audubon. So he's in our region, and he'll be talking about climate change and birds. I think that's like February 9th. So we look forward to seeing you all again on Zoom, or maybe somewhere safe out and about and looking for birds or whatever else you might find. Always share things, send things to our website, pictures you have or comments. It's good to hear from you all. Thank you so much, Jared, and everybody else.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. You're welcome to come to Dubuque anytime. We have 3 breweries now.
Okay.
4. Another one just out. We have 4 breweries now.
Okay.
And some of them you
Thank
can
you.
see the Mississippi River, so you can bird watch at a brewery. It's
Very good.
There you go. Good to see you guys.
Oh,
Thanks,
hi,
everyone.
Bruce. Yep.
Yeah.
See you guys.
Did you